Kia ora, g'day and welcome to the History of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Episode 24, Bob, Part 2, The Machine. This podcast is supported by our amazing patrons, such as Alison. If you want to support Hans, go to patreon.com/historyaotearoa. Before we crack into the first episode, I just want to let you know, we now have a merch store. You can get things like shirts, hoodies, phone cases, cushions and mugs, all with the Hans Tuatara on them. It's another way you can help support the podcast if Patreon isn't your thing and you want to get something to show off as well. The hope is to get more things on there, like pins and hats, but I need to sell some stuff, so Teespring will give me the chance to do that. So the more you buy, the more super sick swag I can peddle. I'll also be on the lookout for people that have ideas for designs we can put on shirts, etc., as well as people who can bring those ideas to paper. So if you have an idea, or you're an artist, hit me up. I'll put a link in the show notes to the storefront if you'd like to have a browse. With that out of the way, here is the second part of the two-part collaboration with the Happy Hour History podcast on the Union leader and New Zealand Labour Movement figure, Bob Semple. Some of you may have already listened to the episode on the Happy Hour History feed, as it has been available there for the last week, so you may switch off as this is the same episode. For those of you who wish to continue, make sure you have listened to part 1, as it covers the early life of Semple and his rise through the Union and Labour movements of Aotearoa, resulting in his appointment to Minister of Public Works just prior to World War II. Just like the last episode, this is in the Happy Hour style. So it's me teaching Caden in a more informal chat, and there is a language warning, as I get very drunk and swear a lot. So if that isn't your cup of tea, maybe give this one a miss. Right then, let's get going.
Hi everyone, this is Caden from Happy Hour History. You may have heard in our last episode that I was doing a collaboration with Thomas, who runs another history podcast called the History of Aotearoa, New Zealand podcast, and he came on to teach me about a Kiwi man called Bob Semple. And so we covered the first half of Semple's life in the last episode, so if you haven't heard that yet, you are going to want to start there. But now this episode, Thomas is finally going to explain to me why this guy is so exciting, why he's kind of well known in the history community, because I actually didn't know anything about him before we started, so this was quite informative for me. So listen on if you have listened to the first part, and I did just want to say before we started anything that at time of recording this, I did not have any kind of exciting news to release, but luckily I do actually have something new to announce today. So I have just created a Patreon. So for anyone who would like to support the podcast beyond just kind of listening and giving feedback, you can go to my Patreon and support me there if you are so inclined. There are various levels of kind of goodies that you can get as a patron. Obviously, all of the normal episodes will still be available to you, even if you decide you don't want to become a patron, totally fine. But patrons at every level, even starting from just $1 a month, will be getting bonus episodes. And I did want to make this known to you all because I'm going to be releasing the first bonus episode in tandem with this. If you're listening to this far, far into the future, this is being released in October of 2019. And so to get kind of the spooky vibes going, I'm going to be releasing a couple of kind of short episodes about some different historical topics that are a bit Halloweeny, but some things that you might not be aware of. But so if you go to my Patreon, which is Happy Hour History Pod, so if you just go to patreon.com/Happy Hour History Pod, or you can just search for me on there, you will instantly get access to the first of these mini episodes if you become a patron. So there's something immediately there, instant gratification for you all. You have a look if you're interested. Like I said, there are different bonuses that you get at the kind of different levels of being a patron that you can involve yourself in. But that's probably enough of Patreon talk. Most of you are here for the regular content, so I will just say, as usual, if you listen to the last episode, this shouldn't be a shock to you, but Thomas will be posting this content on his page as well. So firstly, if you're listening to this here, please go follow him. But also, because we are cross-posting this within the episode itself, you'll hear us just kind of introduce ourselves. And that's just so his audience gets to know me, my audience gets to know him, and it makes it a bit easier for all of us. With that said, why don't we get started? Well, for anyone listening, tuning into part 2, I'm here with Thomas, and we're actually recording this directly after part 1, so it's only gotten messier since the first part of the episode.
Only gotten more pissed. I'm like another cider down. If anyone wants to know, I'm drinking Monteith's crushed pear cider. Hashtag not sponsored. If Monteith's would like to sponsor me, please get in touch. But yeah, no, this is a New Zealand pear cider, which is great. I've also, previous to this, I've been drinking Bond Store Kawakawa gin. Kawakawa is a native New Zealand plant here in New Zealand, so it is gin infused with kawakawa leaves. Also, Bond Store, not hashtag not sponsored, but if you'd like to get in touch with me, please do. I'd very much like a sponsorship.
And you also run a whole podcast. And let's
I run a whole podcast, not drunk, usually.
This one's an anomaly for you.
This one is an anomaly for me. I try not to run my podcasts whilst absolutely fucking smashed. But yeah, I also run the History of Aotearoa New Zealand podcast, which is a chronological history of New Zealand from before people arrived all the way up to probably 2000. I don't know, I haven't got that far yet. But at the moment, we haven't actually hit Europeans. At the moment, we are
That's the best.
Pre-European period. So, you know, we're talking about Māori culture, we're talking about we're gonna talk about weaving at time of recording. We're about to start talking about weaving. We're talking about carving. We're talking about social structure. We're talking about the marae, what the marae means and what it is, and kind of all that sort of stuff. We're going to talk about what Māori were doing, you know, when they arrived in New Zealand and that kind of stuff. Because New Zealand was the last major landmass discovered by humans. So there's some quite interesting things about that and all this sort of stuff. And there's some more interesting history that we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to talk about, unless you're listening way in the future, then we may have talked about it already. But, you know, there's all sorts of other shit that we're going to talk about, all about New Zealand, all about its history, and that kind of stuff. But of course, if you're listening on my feed, you're pretty used to what I'm doing and what I'm talking about. So you may have listened to the previous episode, but I have someone else with me, which is weird. I don't normally have other people with me. Normally it's just me talking into a fucking microphone. So who's the other person that I've got? Hopefully you've listened to the other podcast, otherwise you're going to be really fucking left out. It's going to be a bit weird, but I've got someone else with me.
Yeah, well, hopefully you've listened to part 1, otherwise you've clicked on the wrong place. But I'm Kaden. Yeah. I run the Happy Hour History podcast. Unlike Thomas, who runs a totally serious and adult podcast about something that he puts, time and effort into truly researching well and presenting in an adult manner. I like to drink with friends and teach them about a subject that I think would bring them into the fold of history, make them fans if they have, not thought about history since their, last class in school. And so we generally have a fun time. It's a bit ridiculous. It's more comedy history, so it's a bit less on the straight and narrow, which is exactly why I have my lovely guest host here today a bit pissed. So that's how actually a bit. I was being really generous.
Fucking pissed.
So it's all thanks to me. So I'm really sorry.
Guys, I'm so fucking drunk right now. Like. I'm sorry, if you're a regular listener of the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand, I'm so fucking sorry. I'm so fucking wasted right now.
This is exciting to them. This is like a side they've never had access to.
Anyways, we're here to talk about the Bob Semple, or Bob Semple himself, Robert Semple, Bobby Big Nuts Semple, who, if you've listened to the previous episode, basically the quick and dirty summary is that he was born in Australia, moved to New Zealand after he was blacklisted by the Australian mining companies, and ended up making a name for himself as quite a union leader. Not just in mining, but unions in general. And eventually made his way into Parliament, and then got kicked out, and then came back, and eventually became one of the key figures in the first Labour government. So he's quite an important figure in that regard. So he's all big into unions and that kind of stuff. So if I would recommend going back to the first episode of this to learn about what his background is and who he is and that kind of stuff, because it will kind of help in kind of building that picture of kind of who he is and what is going to happen kind of from now on, because we're going to talk about something specific that he had direct involvement with.
And I am on the edge of my chair. I'm so ready. What I have to know. Where is this going?
So for anyone listening, I've been extremely vague with Caden about who I was going to talk about and what I was going to talk about.
Which is for the best, because otherwise I would have Googled it.
Twitter. Yeah, I have been teasing you on Twitter a little bit about kind of where I'm going. This time, we're going to take a slightly different tack. So to kind of put it in perspective, we are now in World War II. World War II has started. New Zealand has declared war on Nazi Germany, which, if you're listening to this roughly at when it's going to be released, this is actually the 80th year. 2019 is the 80th anniversary of New Zealand and Britain and basically the Commonwealth countries declaring war on Nazi Germany. So it's kind of poetic. We're gonna take a slightly different tack, just briefly. So we're actually going to talk about Australia for one. So we're going to talk about Darwin. Darwin is a city in the Northern Territory of Australia on the Aussie's north coast, and it's a city of about 130,000 people. So it's quite a decently sized city, at least in the context of New Zealand and Australia. I don't know about like London's like fucking 10 million people.
Yeah, at first I was like, oh, that's kind of a small city, and then you're like, oh, it's decently sized, and I was like, okay, yep, decently sized.
Yeah, in terms of like New Zealand, like our largest city is Auckland, and that's about 1 point something million people, right?
Okay.
We've got about 4.8 million people in the country, right? So 130,000 people.
That's cute.
That's reasonably sized for a New Zealand city.
That's so cute. I love that.
Was that meant to be like, derogatory?
Like, not like a pejorative or anything. It just sounds so peaceful to have only that many people.
Yeah, it's so good. Like I live in Wellington, and that's like less than 500,000, I think. So it's pretty good. It's pretty good. I like it. It's pretty good. Like Dunedin is about 130,000 people, and they lose about 20,000 people just to the students leaving every year. So that's like, New Zealand's pretty small. New Zealand's pretty rural. But Darwin, New Zealand, is an Australian city of about 130,000 people on the north coast of Australia. And in 1942, it was bombed by 242 planes from the Japanese Empire, apparently dropping more bombs on the city than that at Pearl Harbor. So it was a massive fucking attack. It was the single largest attack, in fact, by a foreign power on Australian soil. So it was an extremely significant event in Australia's history. And although this is kind of a couple of years ahead and kind of where we are in the story. We're roughly about 1939, 1940 in the story. I mainly want to tell you this because it illustrates that during World War II, there was an ever-present threat, especially prior to the United States entering the war, that Australia and New Zealand as well would be invaded by Japan, and as such would likely fall as a result. Japan is obviously massive. You know, at least at the time, it was an empire. It was huge. It had invaded Manchuria. It had destroyed basically China as we know it. It was unrelenting in its power at the time. And the Empire of the Rising Sun had steamed through areas like Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua, and others. And they even openly talked about how undefended and vulnerable New Zealand was. They were giving us, an absolute indication that we were basically nothing to them, that they could invade us at any time and that we would absolutely be destroyed. That it was they were being pretty fucking ballsy at the time.
Yeah, you read that in the paper and you're like, oh.
Exactly. And in fact, the mood in Aotearoa would have been one similar to that of the British at the time of Dunkirk, which was actually happening roughly at the same time as when our story is at. Britain was faced with a very likely Nazi invasion of the British Isles. They were faced with the possibility that Britain might be invaded for the first time since the 18-something or others, which, here's a fun fact for you. The last time that people think that Britain was invaded was the 1066 invasion from Normandy. That's actually not true. It's actually 18-something or other when a small contingent of French motherfuckers invaded Wales or something. But anyway, it's basically the idea is that Britain is faced with total annihilation at this point, and the mood in New Zealand is likely very similar. We are faced with total annihilation, and the fact is, the Japanese were in fact correct about New Zealand's defenselessness. We had 6 Bren gun carriers. Which are essentially lightly armoured vehicles carrying a Bren gun, which is a type of machine gun during World War II. So, we had 6 of those for the entire country. Not just one area, the entire country. In the entire country, the landmass of New Zealand is roughly similar to Japan itself. So, Japan has an entire empire. It has fleets, it has tanks, it has men, and to defend an area roughly similar size of New Zealand. And New Zealand has 6 things on wheels with machine guns on them.
I imagine.
That's our armored division.
I can just imagine that they're taking stock of the military's capabilities and they're like, oh, how many of those do you have? Someone's like, oh yeah, 6, and they're like, oh, 6,000? No. 600?
Yes.
No. And they're like, oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah, that's basically what it was, right? New Zealand's landmass is larger than that of Britain, right? So New Zealand is big. New Zealand is really big. The thing is that we've got a big old mountain range in the middle of the South Island. That's what.
That.
Yeah.
I feel like that just shook me a little bit.
Yeah, if you take North Island, South Island, and Stewart Island, it is a larger landmass than Britain. Scotland.
Maybe it's just because you guys are right next to Australia, and so it makes you look really small because Australia's fucking massive. Yeah. But I didn't know that. That's amazing. Okay, I learned something.
Yeah, the other thing is, of course, we have a lot less people. Britain has, tens of millions of people, whereas ours is roughly 4.8 million people. And part of that is because in the South Island, we have a great big fucking mountain range in the middle of the South Island called the Southern Alps. And of course, that entire area is uninhabitable. So no one lives there, or, no major kind of urban centres are there. So it's actually, New Zealand's actually really big. You just kind of don't know it, as you say, because Australia's right there and Australia's fucking...
I'm not gonna lie, you telling me how empty it is and also how mountainous it is, I'm like, next trip. That's where I'm going.
Yeah, so to kind of kind of put it out there. There's a map on Google Images that shows you how many people don't live within a square kilometer of those areas, right? So it's colored green for anyone that isn't living there within 1 square kilometer. Most of the country is green, right? Like, most people don't live within a square kilometer of basically the landmass of New Zealand.
The idea that like I could go there and like travel around and almost never see another person. Oh, you've done it. I'm in.
The only thing about that is people tend to underestimate New Zealand's weather. Because we're quite a long, narrow country, weather can change within a day, right? I can go to work and it can be fucking scorching hot, and by the end of the day, it can be absolutely fucking pissing down with rain. You know, and a lot of people have actually died trying to climb mountains and stuff because they underestimated that. They went out in the morning, it was a great day in the morning, and they went, cool, I'm going to go climb, Mount Cook, or Aotearoa Mount Cook, which is the highest mountain in New Zealand. But they didn't take any raincoats, and it absolutely fucking buckets down within, by the afternoon. And they're like, oh shit, I don't have any gear to deal with that.
Rain. Yeah, the good news is that I respect and fear nature, and therefore would not do anything that I didn't think I would survive.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm gonna stick to like really nice, clear paths, like anywhere I know that I could be easily found.
Yeah, definitely. New Zealand's really good for that because we do have like the Department of Conservation deals with all like the trails and stuff and all the huts and shit and that kind of thing. But the good thing about New Zealand is we don't have like Australia. Every second thing in Australia is trying to murder you. It's venomous. It's poisonous. It's got sharp claws or spiky teeth or something. New Zealand is like, we got birds. And that's basically it. We don't have mammals, mostly. So
no mammals. That's
fuck.
Weird.
We're gonna go on a bit of a tangent here.
We've already gone so far off of what we were supposed to be talking about.
Okay, so New Zealand, in terms of endemic mammals, that is mammals that are only found in New Zealand, there are only 2 species of bats. Those are the only mammals that we have in New Zealand that are actually meant to be here. We do have other mammals at the moment in terms of mammals that were brought over by Europeans. So in particular, we have rats, which were also brought over by Māori as well. So the Kiore, or the Pacific rat, was also brought over by Māori. But we also have the ship's rat and the Norway rat. The ship's rat is the black rat, famously the perpetrator of the Black Plague. But we also have possums, Australian brush-tailed possums, and stoats, ferrets, weasels, that kind of stuff, as well as hedgehogs and that kind of thing as well. So we have a whole bunch of mammals that are wrecking our environment and is a really big problem in New Zealand for destroying our native flora and fauna.
Anyways, I have, just through curiosity and interest, driven us so far off of what we should be talking about. So let's go back into the Second World War.
Let's go back to the Second World War and what New Zealand was doing during the Second World War. So, of course, New Zealand was pretty defenseless when it came to our armoured division. As I said, we only had 6 Bren gun carriers for the entire fucking country, which was roughly the same size as Japan, larger than the British Isles. So that's not fucking good enough, basically. So Britain in 1940 was, of course, more concerned with its own survival in terms of Dunkirk was roughly happening in 1940 as well. So, as mentioned, supplies of any description, be they guns, ammo, food, materials, or tanks, would not be arriving anytime soon. So we could not rely on the fact that Britain, our mother country, would be coming to our aid. We had to do something ourselves, right? In steps our boy, Bobby Big Nuts Semple, to fix the problem. So he said, Bobby Big Nut Semple, or Robert Semple if you're polite, said, quote, if this country is to be invaded, we need to have equipment as good as that of the other fellow, if not better. we could not buy tanks from outside, but had to act on our own resources. Luckily, we had big tractors here, and they were a godsend. They had proved one of the greatest boons the country had ever known, permitting us to build highways, aerodromes, camps, and fortifications in record time in the Dominion. They have proved invaluable for other urgent purposes outside New Zealand. End quote. So, Bobby is gonna fucking solve our problem in regards to our armoured division. Right?
Daddy's here.
So, Bobby is here.
I really feel like I need to. I feel like I need to clarify that I said Daddy's here, and I feel like that was important.
Daddy is here.
Dad's on the
Daddy
scene.
Semple is here. So, Aotearoa had no armoured force, apart from those Bren gun carriers. And by that I mean, we had no tanks. We had no Shermans, we had no Panzers, we had nothing. We had nothing but men with guns and probably pitchforks. So, that's all we had. So, we had to get some tanks from somewhere. Because, of course, the Japanese Empire were taunting us, saying we could probably invade you at any point and you would fall. So we had to get tanks from somewhere to try and at least elevate ourselves to some sort of, fighting force to be able to combat them effectively. So initially, the Department of Defense had made inquiries to the United States for supplies of armored plate. Armored plate, of course, being pretty fucking important to tanks, right? You know? So, simple though, and a slightly different idea in mind. The idea of the Department of Defense was to get armored plate from the United States to build a tank and then use that to defend against a potential Japanese invasion. Semple had seen a photo of a Caterpillar tractor on a postcard, an American postcard, and decided that was pretty good because he had seen the postcard showed a Caterpillar tractor that had been converted into a tank. And he went, yeah, sweet as. That's good enough.
That's fine.
So
You're
yeah,
welcome.
so he thought, yeah, American postcard, converted Caterpillar tank, sweet as. That's good enough for me. And as such, the spark for a legend was born. So, the thing about this was it would take time to get blueprints from America for this tank. And so Semple had his sort of let's do this attitude, which if you're a Kiwi, that's a joke for you. Let's do this. So that's a joke for you guys. So he basically said, fuck that, and got to work with no plans whatsoever. He had no blueprints, he had nothing but a fucking postcard to go off. And he went to work with his departmental engineers in Temuka, which is in South Canterbury, which is south of Christchurch, if you kind of know where that is in the South Island. So he went to work. So the idea was that they would take 81 Caterpillar tractors, which were similar to kind of bulldozers, and build armoured bodies for them. So I have actually got pictures of those tractors. Or I've got a picture of a tractor to kind of give you an idea of, kind of what we're looking at here.
Alrighty, let's get this pulled up.
So you kind of see what...
It's so cute.
Yeah.
It's like baby's first
like
tank.
Bulldozer.
This is adorable.
So that was a tractor used in New Zealand for a variety of different purposes. And the idea was that we were going to build an armoured body for that tractor to
You're
turn
just
into a
gonna
tank.
militarize this shit. Aw.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was the hope, right?
Doesn't sound like it's
We
gonna
had
go so
81.
well.
Yeah.
That was the hope.
81 of tractors throughout the country. So
Were these
this,
like privately owned?
yeah, mostly, privately owned. So this would be effective as the vehicles could operate as per normal in the fields, and then once they were called upon for military service, they could be fitted with the armor, which would require minimal modification to the tractor itself. So the idea is that they build an armored body for the tank, and then if New Zealand gets invaded by the Japanese, then they could put the armor onto the tractor, and then that would turn it into a tank.
Oh my god, it's like a cute little outfit for him.
Exactly.
Honestly, I know this is weird to say, but like this tractor, it just looks like baby's first tank. Like, yeah, he's just so small.
he's so cute.
So small, but so strong.
So small. So that was the idea, right? You got to tractor.
Okay.
You got a tractor. You put an armored body on him, then he's a tank, right? That was the idea. So the point being that you could take the tractor, he could be out doing whatever he's doing normally, and then easily be fitted with a tank.
He's doing such important work. It's just so cute.
He's a big boy now.
I'm just so proud. Okay. I need to take this seriously. This is serious business.
That's a serious business.
We don't laugh on this podcast. It's not funny.
We don't like to have fun. We don't have fun on this. History is serious. Okay.
Okay, continue.
Anyway, an early prototype of this tank was made in June of 1940, with the armor being substituted for plywood at this early stage. So it was kind of like a concept, right? So like, this is what we can do. If we had the, substituting the plywood for metal, this is the kind of thing that we're looking at, right? So it's just a bit of a proof of concept type thing. And even at this point, armament for anti-tank or infantry support roles was ruled out for various restrictions. So they thought about putting anti-tank weaponry or anti-infantry weaponry, and they thought that's not going to work due to, how the tractor works, how much the tractor can, how much weight the tractor can take, that kind of stuff. So they'd already ruled that out at this very early stage, that wasn't going to work. However, a 37mm cannon on a revolving turret and machine guns were seen as of vital importance. So they knew that they definitely have to have those on. So the thing about that, though, was that due to those wartime issues of procurement that we kind of already talked about, so the fact that they couldn't get tanks from overseas or they couldn't get other materials from overseas, whether that be from Britain or the United States or whoever, a cannon could not be sourced. So they couldn't put a cannon on the top. They couldn't, they just didn't have the ability to get a cannon because it wasn't made locally, and due to a variety of different factors, they couldn't get it from overseas because, there was a fucking war on, right? So they couldn't source the cannon, and instead it was replaced with another machine gun. So in total, this would mean the tank would be armed with 6 Bren .303 caliber guns. Machine guns, I should say. So Bren was a standard issue Britain machine gun. So you can look that up. I didn't look into it too much, but if you want to look that up, you can. But basically, it's a standard issue Britain machine gun that most squads had one member of that squad issued with it so that they could operate it. So they were not totally widespread, but most squads had at least one operator that could operate a Bren machine gun. So they had 6 Bren machine guns, 1 on each side of the tank, 1 at the back, 1 in the turret, and 2 in the front, bringing the total crew of the tank to 8 when you also include a driver and a commander. Right? Because they're obviously, you need someone to drive the fucking tank, and you needed someone to tell the tank where to fucking go, plus the 6 other boats to actually fucking shoot out of it. Right? So
where do they fit them?
You had a crew of 8.
Where do they go?
Where do they go? Now, this is the interesting thing.
Oh, I'm glad that there's an answer to this.
Yeah, so this was in an ideal world where New Zealand could field enough men. Obviously, at this point, New Zealand had about 1 million people in total, as a population. That's including women and children as well. So the likelihood of being able to field 8 men per tank was pretty unlikely. But the other thing that should be noted as well is that one of the 6 gunners did need to lie on a mattress on top of the engine, which is not an ideal position because the engine is going blah, 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 right the whole time, and you're fucking sitting on this engine going blah, 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 right the whole time, trying to fucking shoot Nazis out of it. Ideally, that's not gonna work. Your aim is gonna be shit. So
did they
that's not gonna work.
Did they make them bigger? Where do you fit 8 people? I'm gonna tell you guys, it's real small in this picture.
Yep.
You put the armor over it, and it gets like 3 times bigger. No, it's real fucking small in there. They just cram 8 people.
Pretty much.
They'd all be on that mattress at that point.
Pretty much. Yeah. So it's not a great situation to be in. And saying that, though, tanks generally in World War II were not a great situation to be in. For anyone who's listening, the movie Fury with Brad Pitt, I'd recommend watching that, which is all about a tank crew going through World War II to kind of show you how shit it was. So it's not a great position to be in. So after all this, we had the plywood, we had the concept. So the next step was to make the tank an actual steel plate to present to the army for consideration. So we needed to present it to the army so that they could go, yeah, that's something that we want, or no, fuck that, that's fucking awful. So we needed, Bob needed to make it, Semple needed to make it an actual steel plate. The kind of problem with that was that due, again, to the kind of wartime considerations or the procurement issues that we had, steel actually wasn't available. Not even from Australia, who was the closest neighbour to New Zealand. So instead of actual steel, corrugated iron was used. Which I don't know how much corrugated iron is used outside of New Zealand. But corrugated iron is a metal commonly used in New Zealand for quick and dirty projects like sheds. And it can be seen a lot just kind of lying around. So corrugated iron, for anyone who doesn't know, is basically, I think it's like magnesium or manganese or fucking something like that. Basically, it's like real wavy, right? It kind of looks kind of real wavy. And it's generally not used for anything that you think is going to stand the test of time. Right? Like, Rome did not make the fucking Parthenon whatever out of fucking corrugated iron because it's a shit metal, right? The general idea was that it was made out of a pretty crap metal that you could find anywhere in New Zealand. So it was readily available. That was kind of the main thing. So it was very common, but not really designed for tank armor, is the kind of takeaway from there. And the thing about that was adding corrugated iron reduced the speed of the tractor cum tank to about 10 kilometers per hour, which is about 5 to 6 miles per hour for those of you who work in freedom units. So along with this, the body rolled badly while off-road, making fire on the move very difficult. So the tank kind of rolled from side to side, as it kind of was off-road, and, it shook a lot. Obviously, one bastard was on the mattress while on the fucking tank, so he's going like the whole time. So it was a big fucking problem.
And you can't aim when you're moving then, so you just gotta stop, and you're like, okay, everybody stop moving, go take aim.
Yeah, which obviously has pretty massive tactical implications, right? And the main problem being that New Zealand at this time, and even today, is the bulk of New Zealand's landmass is rural, right? Is off-road. Very few. New Zealand obviously has another number of major urban centres, but the tank would be expected to be going off-road probably 95% of the time. So if you can't shoot out of the fucking tank for 95% of the New Zealand's landmass, that's just not going to fucking work. That's no fucking good. So It wasn't great. So when it was shown to the army, they, at least for starters, they weren't terribly happy with the lack of turret cannon. But to be honest, they just basically said, fuck it, there were no other options, and they actually ordered 3 more to be built.
Like, yeah, at this point, let's just do it, I guess.
They just went, fuck it, let's do it, it'll be fine. So they ordered 3 more tanks to be built because no one else was doing anything better. So the armor of these, so we're gonna throw some stats at you a little bit now. So the armor of these 3 tanks would consist of 2 layers of corrugated iron, which would result in a total of 21 millimeters of armor, which is 0.82 inches, again, for those of you working in Freedom Unit. So this was supposedly, quote, severely tested, end quote, and was alleged to be sufficient to stop anti-tank rifle bullets, as well as being easy to make. So, all things considered, that's pretty fucking good. You know, a metal that is, you know, pretty readily available. You put 2 of those metals slapped together, and it can stop anti-tank bullets. That's pretty fucking good.
Is that alleged or is it true?
The quote said it was severely tested.
And so at no point was this ever proven wrong, as far as we know.
Yeah. So cool. As far as I can tell on my research, this was true. It could stop.
I was worried that you'd then be like, but, and that there was I wasn't sure if that's where we were moving. So no. So actually, it was
as far as we can tell, yeah, it could stop.
It was just successful.
So yeah, as I said, that's pretty fucking good. And you know, all things considered. On top of that, special trailers were also made to move them around, being able to be unloaded and combat ready in a matter of minutes. So you could load them onto this tractor cum tank onto a trailer, drive it to where you needed it to go, and unload it and have it combat ready in less than 5 minutes, essentially, which is fantastic. And the cool thing is I actually have a picture of one of these trailers. So that's kind of what it looked like. It kind of looks like a trailer. I mean, there's nothing super special about it.
Oh my, he's so tall.
Yeah, so this also shows the actual tank itself. So the corrugated line with this kind of wavy design on top of the tractor as well. On top of the trailer.
The trailer obviously is cool because it's the transport, but then the tank, which was originally not a tank, it's still just as small as it looked earlier, and it's fitting 8 people somehow, but it's so tall. Yeah.
So the thought was as well, it'd probably fit anywhere. It'd probably fit like 6 to 7 people potentially due to manpower restrictions and stuff. But yeah, ideally that tank would fit 8 people. Is the idea. So it's not big. It's not big.
You have to really make friends with the people in there. Because
absolutely.
You're gonna be a bit on top of each other.
Yeah, you gotta get real friendly with the other blokes that are gonna be in there. Fortunately. So there was this trailer that was built, and Bob Semple was pretty happy with this. So in January 1941, the first tank of the 3 that were ordered was finished in March, and the second tank. So the first tank was finished in January, and the second tank was finished in March, and the third tank was finished a bit later on in the year. But the first 2 tanks took part in a parade in Christchurch, which is in the South Island. So they took part in a parade in Christchurch in April, with one being sent to Wellington and then subsequently onto Auckland to basically promote the war effort. So their idea was that they were going to send those tanks out into some parades and promote the war effort, hopefully drum up some support, people donating money or goods or whatever else, trying to, really get the public on side with this war that at least the government thought was a good idea. Unfortunately...
there's the but.
The but, yes. this was met with public ridicule and earned the tanks their name, quote, Bob Semple's tank. Later reduced to just calling it.
That's literally just what it is, though.
Yeah, so Bob
I love
Semple
that. I love the ridicule. They're like, "Ooh, it's Bob Semple's tank," and that's like, yeah, but that is it. Yeah,
that is what it is.
You're correct.
That is right. So
I like
this
how
has
it
later
becomes
implications down the line. Yeah. So it was later reduced to calling him just the Bob Semple, right? Which is what we call it today, is the Bob Semple tank. So the thing about this, though, is the ridicule at these events wasn't entirely misguided, as the crews were instructed not to change gears during these events, because the whole tank had to be made stationary to change gears. So you actually had to stop it and then change gears, and then it could go again. And the thing was, Semple worried that the public may think that the tank had stalled if it stopped in the middle of the road, the driver changed gears, and then he continued on, which obviously wouldn't be a good look. So I've got couple more pictures of the tank. So that's the tank. And then the second picture I've sent you is the tank with Bob Semple next to it. So Bob Semple, as I understand it, is the man on the left in that second picture.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like you have that, like, the kind of wavy iron and then just like a random gun just stuck straight out the side.
Yeah.
So beautiful.
So good. And remember, there's a tractor directly underneath that. So there's an actual, agricultural device underneath that tank.
He's multi-purposed.
Exactly. So,
a man of many talents.
The idea, right? The idea that you could slap the armor on top and you'd have a tank, but during the interim of it not being needing to be a tank, you can make it a tractor. So August 1941, the tank armor was subjected to even more testing. So we already know that it could, that it was subjected to certain types of machine gun fire and that kind of thing. But it was subjected to more testing, specifically intensive machine gun fire and accurate close-range sniping, resulting in some weaknesses being highlighted due to the machine gun ports allowing for some bullets to enter the tank. So those machine guns machine gun ports that you see in the previous pictures, they actually let bullets into them, which was, not great. To put it in the simplest terms, it's not a good thing.
It's not great,
but otherwise, not too bad. In fact, the General Chief of Staff, which was Major General Edward Puttock, so one of the highest-ranking generals in New Zealand at the time, in absence of an alternative, said that it was a very useful weapon for a certain style of warfare.
That sounds like it's shade dressed as a compliment.
Absolutely. I was about to say it is a kind of backhanded compliment in a sense. He is kind of saying that it's kind of all right, but at the same time, it's kind of shit.
I recognize that we can't do literally anything else about this right now, so it's fine. But in a certain style of war, maybe this wouldn't be ideal.
Yeah, exactly. So he's kind of saying, yeah, it's not great, but fucking hell, no, we haven't got anything else, so fuck it. It's good enough, And the kind of fun fact about Major General Puttock is that he later attained the rank of Lieutenant General, and he was the first New Zealand person born to do so. So, that's kind of a cool thing. But in any case, the general thought it was powerfully armed, and the speed was sufficient. Which, if I was a general, I would think 10 kilometers per hour was not sufficient. But that's fine, he thought it was. In fact, the only thing he didn't like was the height, in particular the turret. which added about 60 centimeters, which is about 2 feet. It didn't really add much gain. It was just another machine gun and not a cannon, right? So you've already got, 5 machine guns on the outside of the tank, plus you've got this turret that has another machine gun.
If there's no cannon, it's just not worth it.
Exactly. So it makes you a bigger target when in fact you're not really gaining all that much by adding another cannon.
I do have to say, he looks a little top heavy.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's kind of the thing, right? So Puddock actually recommended the removal of the turret based on the fact that it was a machine gun. If it was a cannon, he was all good. He said, yeah, if it's a cannon, there is absolutely value in that, right? But there's no value in just it being another machine gun. So, if there's another machine gun, just fucking chop the top off. Don't worry. Despite this, it was seen as being Semple's tank. It was politically aligned with Semple himself, which would cause certain sort of issues and things later on down the line. So further tests in October of 1941 at the Burnham camp near Rolleston, which is also outside Christchurch, were conducted, and Puddock was actually in person attending those tests. And the Major General, of course, at this time, he was an experienced commander. So he was actually recently returned from the Mediterranean front. So New Zealand at this time was quite experienced in North Africa. So New Zealand was quite involved with the North African campaign, in particular in the Battle of El Alamein. In fact, New Zealand has a battalion that had been called the 28th Battalion, which was colloquially known as the Māori Battalion because it was made entirely of Māori individuals. And Field Marshal Erwin the Desert Fox Rommel, so one of the big boys in Nazi Germany, said something to the effect of, "Give me an army of the Māori Battalion and I will conquer the world." So New Zealand was pretty fucking involved and quite highly regarded in the North African campaign at this point, and Puddock was involved in kind of that whole kind of saga, essentially. So it was a huge fucking deal. He actually, knew his stuff, and he said, quote, "The arrangement of the turret and of the machine guns was ingenious and efficient," end quote. And that, quote, "I was impressed with the skill and ingenuity displayed by those concerned in the tank's design and manufacture, adapting a civilian vehicle for military purposes," end quote. So, to kind of break that down, despite the tank being laughed at throughout this whole thing, there was someone with actual military experience saying, actually, it's not that fucking bad. He's kind of, again, he's still got that kind of backhanded kind of shade thing going on. But he's saying, yeah, you know what? Yeah, it's fucking alright.
It's functional. It works.
It works. That's not great. It could definitely be better, but, he's actually pretty impressed by it, overall, which is kind of amazing. And even in recent times, it's become a bit of a meme, despite all of this kind of thing. There is a question on Quora. I think it's called Quora. Quora.
Yes.
That basically asks what would win between 10 Tiger tanks and 4,000 Bob Semple tanks. Which the community seems to be divided on. Some say that the Tiger tanks are obviously going to win because they have the superior firepower, but others seem to say that the Bob Semple tanks, you're going to lose probably about 2,000 of them to the Tiger tanks, but at some point they're going to be overrun. With 6 Bren guns, and they may move slow, but they got 6 Bren guns and stuff. They're going to eventually be overrun. So, the community seems a bit divided on that kind of stuff. And there are
weigh in, listeners. What will win?
Yeah, what will win? put it in the comments below. This isn't a YouTube video, but put it in the comments below. You know, what do you think would win? 10 Tiger tanks or 4,000 Bob Semple tanks? So, yeah, so there's a bit of kind of controversy, I guess, into what is better.
I understand this is a tank.
Yeah.
And it is serving a very serious military function. Why is it so cute?
I think it's just like, you know, it's quite compact compared to like other tanks. You know, you see other tanks and they got the long fucking nose and shit.
Yeah,
and
they're
look
scary.
Quite menacing.
They're scary. Yeah, this one just looks like if you had a pet tank. That's what it would look like.
That's what it would look like. Yeah.
There's something very endearing about it, and it's really weird.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'll kind of talk about that actually a little bit kind of later on. But, yeah, it is quite a kind of endearing tank, right? Despite the fact that you know it's meant to be a weapon of war.
A murder device.
Yeah, a murder device. So the kind of thing with this, though, was that it was tied to Semple personally, as you know, kind of politically, right? Because his name was all over it. You know, it was called Bob Semple's tank, or the Bob Semple tank, or something like that. So his opponents actually used it as ammo against him. You know, when they kind of had a problem with him, they said, you know, you've made a shit tank. You know, that kind of thing. And that was, you know, kind of low-hanging fruit when it came to, you know, political kind of attacks, because, yeah, I mean, objectively, the tank was pretty fucking terrible, really. It was slow. It was hard to fire when moving. It had no cannon, only another machine gun, and comparatively weak armor to tanks of similar weight. And of course, it needed to be stationary to change gears. The other thing is, it actually
or rolling downhill.
Yeah, if you're going downhill, you can change gears and it will still keep moving. But I personally find that kind of cheating, because gravity is doing the work for you. So, yeah, effectively it had to stay stationary unless you were going downhill, where gravity was then doing the work.
I assume just the engine needs to not be running, which in both cases would work.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, and the other thing was it had no top hatch, right? You couldn't pop out the top and have the guy sort of sit there quite nicely. It didn't have a top hatch. The only exit was actually out the back of the tank. So you could open a door out the back and all you guys could come out of there. But the problem with that was if you only have one entrance when your whole fucking tank is on fire or being attacked or something, it's not ideal, right? You know, health safety codes do dictate that you need to have more than one exit in the event of a fire. So
where's my emergency exit row with the extra leg room?
Exactly. You know, I want to have that leg room. You know, I want to be on the mattress, you know, lying down, you know, with all that fucking leg space. You know, but of course I can't get out the fucking roof. I have to go out the back with the other bastards. So, you know, chances are I'm gonna fucking die by that point. So it was a big fucking problem in the event of emergency as well. But after all of that, eventually the tanks were handed over officially to the New Zealand Army with their turrets removed, given that the cannons actually still hadn't been sourced. So the idea was that they would get cannons and then put them on top of the tank, but that still hadn't happened. So they removed the turrets and then handed them over officially to the New Zealand Army to do with whatever they so desired. And General Puddock, again, recommended that no more vehicles of this type be made and deemed the 3 tanks suitable for beach defence, should they come to that. So, again, kind of a backhanded comment, you know, kind of saying, yeah, they're a bit shit, but, you know, they're all right for beach defence, no worries. So, you know, it's something. So, yeah, so they weren't, you know, he at least deemed that they weren't too bad. So the tanks were stripped of their armor and returned to civilian duties, basically awaiting their calls for military service. Basically, you know, of course, that the idea being that those armor kind of sets could be quite easily put onto the tractors and then welded to the tractors so that they could be used for military service. So they were put back into the fields to do what they normally do in the event of Japan invading New Zealand. The thing about this, though, was that call never came. Of course, the US entered the war after Pearl Harbor, and they actually pushed the Japanese Empire back across the Pacific, to say nothing of the fact that better, faster, and more ingenious designs became available. For anyone who's a kind of a tank historian, Valentine tanks were being delivered from Britain, and even the humble Bren carrier ended up being produced locally. So, in fact, the US entered the war. They ended up basically reaming the Japanese Empire in the arse. So they ended up being fine. And the fact that, Valentine tanks, which is a British tank, ended up, coming about, ended up being pretty good. And we ended up making Bren carriers ourselves. So we ended up having more than just fucking 6 of them in the end. So, pretty good.
You had 10 of them.
So in the end, they were actually supplanted by a variety of different factors. In saying that they never got the call, though, to military service, that's not actually 100% true. It is reported that the third tank that was built did actually see military service in the Pacific Theatre, albeit it was stripped of its armor and fitted with a bulldozer blade, so it wasn't actually a tank. It was actually still military service as a tractor or a bulldozer.
I'm very proud of him.
Yeah.
I'm very proud.
So proud.
Rose to the occasion.
My boy. So there was some sort of military service by at least one of the tanks that was a tractor.
He did it. Did he come home?
I believe so. Yeah, I didn't quite look into that, and I couldn't find much on it. But yeah, at least from what I can tell, he did come home.
I'm very concerned for New Zealand's first son.
First son.
Third tank, but first in our hearts.
First in our hearts. So, to many, of course, this tank was a colossal failure. From a technical standpoint, you would be right. As I kind of mentioned earlier, it had a multitude of problems that made it terrible. And it has been dubbed, quote, the worst tank ever built, end quote. And in personal opinion, that's not necessarily, incorrect. Right? But in my opinion, that wasn't what it was about. Yes, the hope was to make a functional tank. There was the idea that we could make a tank that could defend ourselves from potential invasion. But even more importantly, I would argue, it showed Aotearoa New Zealand and the wider world that we would not go quietly. Semple even said in October 1941, quote, that tank was an honest-to-God effort to do something with the material at our disposal when raiders were at our back door. Instead of sitting down and moaning, we felt we ought to do something to manufacture weapons that would help defend our country and our people, end quote. So, he was a staunch defender of this tank, even so up until his death. He actually was never embarrassed or shied away from, his attempt to make a tank. For example, in 1943, on the House floor in Parliament, he had the following exchange. So he said, quote, when we came to office, we had insufficient strength to protect a current bun from the attack of a blowfly. But the Japs could be killed with wheelbarrows. We could have stoushed them. We had plenty of barrows. 2 years before the war, we quietly slipped machines into Fiji and Tonga and built aerodromes there secretly. It was plain as day that the Japs would strike south through the back door of Singapore, island hopping to New Zealand. What stopped them this way? End quote. So there was a retort from the floor that mocked Semple, saying, quote, probably your tanks, Bob, end quote. So, the Parliament was pretty fucking thought it was pretty fucking funny that he built this dumbass tank. But Bob replied, quote, "If that was a cheap snare, you keep it. I had the vision to try and create something while a lot of others were just sniveling," end quote. And it is recorded that laughter and applause to this response is recorded.
I mean, he ain't wrong.
The floor obviously appreciated that. So, in modern times, this kind of quote, at least in my opinion, is shortened to, "I don't see anyone else coming up with any better ideas." Which, at least, again, in my opinion, really epitomizes this story, right? So, for all its failings and mockery, the Bob Semple tank was New Zealand's continuation of our number 8 wire ingenuity, or our attitude of number 8 wire ingenuity, using what we had to build something that worked. It was a continuation of us punching above our weight on the world stage, and in my opinion, pulling the middle finger to the world and saying, "Fuck you, come get some." For me, at least, this is Aotearoa's version of Churchill's "fight them in the beaches" speech. It's our call to arms. It is our act of defiance. The tank was our way of steering the full might of the Japanese Empire, arguably the most powerful empire the Pacific had ever seen up until this point, in the face. Giving them a pukana, which is that thing that you see the All Blacks doing with the tongue. So it's like, it's quite a scary sort of thing. Showing them that they could take our islands from our cold, dead, fucking hands. It is, in my opinion, it is, I unironically love the Bob Semple tank. It stands for everything that New Zealand, I think, has stood for up until this point. As I said, basically showing the world, who we are, standing up to them and basically saying, "Fuck you, we can stand with the best of them, even if we've only got minimal amount of people."
I think there's something so valiant about saying, "We will fight you until we have literally nothing left to fight you with." Anything we have.
That's what I think as well. This was, as Bob Semple said, an honest-to-God effort to, take what we had and fight to the literal death. Had Japan actually invaded, it probably would have been fucking terrible. But you could not argue that we absolutely fucking tried. So, that's my piece. That's my 10. So, of course, you're probably wondering what actually happened to Bob Semple after the war. So after the war, unfortunately, his support of conscription and later compulsory military service in 1948 basically bit him in the ass. His allies saw it as a betrayal, but as he saw it, saw it as a continuing, as he always had, as he viewed the spread of communism as a threat to the free world. So, as kind of mentioned last episode, he was very against communism, despite the fact that he was very pro-socialism. But there is a difference there. Even though his allies thought it was he was betraying them, he thought it was a continuation of what he'd always done. He believed his precious trade unions were hiding communist revolutionaries, and he allowed them more power and influence, and allowing those communist revolutionaries more power and influence. So he denounced communist union leaders, and he fought them openly. He fought them openly quite often. And he even wrote a pamphlet called "Why I Fight Communism," in which he warned the country to be on guard from the communist menace, and saying that though it is disputed as to whether he actually wrote it, someone else may have ghostwritten it for him. So Semple remained in Parliament after Labour's defeat in 1949, although he was plagued by health issues for the last few years of his career, resulting in his retirement before the 1954 election.
Yeah, because he's got to be like 70 or 80 now. 70-something, 80.
I am about to tell you. So he died in January of 1955, so a year after his retirement, at the age of 82.
Okay.
So he was quite old when he finally retired. So he was survived by his wife, and 2 daughters and 2 sons. So whatever you think of Bob Semple and his tank, no one can argue that he didn't fight for what he thought was right, at least in my opinion. He was one of the most colourful and flamboyant characters of the early 20th century New Zealand labour movement, using his intelligence, get-stuck-in attitude, and talent for rhetoric to get the movement political legitimacy and improve the rights and conditions of his fellow workers, which I think he actually did. He did actually improve wages and working conditions of the people that he saw, as his fellow man from his time in his early 20s, early 30s. So, he did actually set out to do kind of what he promised to his fellow workers. But, as with all historical figures, he was not perfect. He was authoritarian. There's no way getting around that. As his position as Minister of Public Works, he was authoritarian, garnering himself many enemies among his usually potential allies. And he did flip-flop on conscription, not to mention the fact that his tank didn't work basically at all, perhaps for what it actually intended to work for. And it didn't actually see active service, which isn't necessarily his fault. But there are a lot of things to be said that, he wasn't a perfect guy. He's got flaws, but he also did obviously a lot of great things as well. Though it could be argued that he is one of the critical figures in the beginning of the modern Labour Party, which is, at time of recording, currently in government and being led by Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, which, again, at time of recording, is looking at making abortion and cannabis legal. So, depending on which side of the fence you sit on that, that's a pretty good thing. His legacy lives on in the form of his party, the party that he, kind of set up and kind of helped to set up. Living on, is actually in power and has been in power a number of times. The last time the Labour Party was in power was under Helen Clark, the second Prime Minister, the second female Prime Minister of New Zealand. That's kind of fucking amazing, really. But to kind of round it out and to kind of finish, I think it is best to sum up Bob Semple using the words of Major General Robert Young, who was the Dominion commander of the Home Guard in 1940. He said, quote, "I am proud to be associated with him. He has for what I wish everyone had, a will to win the war. For when a man has a will to win the war, nothing can stop him," end quote.
Well, that was fascinating, and truly I didn't know any of it. So I have been very effectively taught today.
Despite the fact I am quite drunk.
So before we let everyone go, why don't you tell people how they can find you on any social media that you run for your podcast and your website as well?
Yeah, so I, as I mentioned, I am the host of the History of Aotearoa New Zealand podcast. So if you want to find me or connect with me, you can connect with me on the website, which is historyaotearoa.com, or my email is at historyaotearoa@gmail.com, or my Twitter is at historyaotearoa, or Facebook, History Aotearoa New Zealand podcast. Aotearoa is spelled Aotearoa for anyone who's not familiar with that. And if you really like my shit that I do, I also have a Patreon. So Patreon/historyaotearoa.com. Patreon/historyaotearoa if you want to, donate money, but you should probably listen to what I do first before I do that. But yeah, that's how you connect with me on social media or any other way if you want to either say, hey, you're a good bastard, or hey, fuck you, you're dumb. So, yeah.
Either way is all good. And you can find my podcast, Happy Hour History, just find the podcast itself, obviously searching that. You can find me on Twitter, it's at Happy History Pod. My Instagram is at Happy Hour History Pod. and my Facebook should just be like Happy Hour History Podcast or whatever. It should all be the same logo. And if you have like questions, comments, ideas, whatever, you want to tell me that this was dumb, I don't really care. You can email me at happyhourhistorypod@gmail.com, and you can let me know what you thought. If anyone out there is interested as well in subjecting themselves to the hot seat of being forced to drink at weird hours of the day to accommodate my weird time zone situation, then you are more than welcome to let me know if you'd like to guest host, because this has been so much fun. I've had such a good time.
Yeah, for anyone who, again, if you haven't listened to the first episode, it is currently fucking hell, it is 12 o'clock in the afternoon nearly here in New Zealand, and Caden is at probably, I guess, 12 a.m. In Britain. So I've been up since 7 o'clock this morning drinking, which probably by most doctors is not recommended. But
only if it's a mimosa, which I can tell the listeners it wasn't.
It wasn't. It was mostly gin and cider. So I'm probably going to go take a nap after this, try and knock off all of the alcohol. So yeah. So
thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. This has been a weirdly beautiful episode. I learned so much. And we had far too much to drink on opposite sides of the earth. And where else can you enjoy that kind of content? So thanks for listening. And whichever podcast you're listening to this on, hopefully the next episode is better.
Hopefully.